Welcome to the Pharma Podcast, conversations with industry experts and business leaders about important and current topics in Canadian pharma, biotech, and medtech. I'm your host, Sam Tarantino. Today, I'm speaking with Deborah Brown, Managing Partner at Accelera Canada. Accelera Canada is Canada's premier consulting firm offering end-to-end advice and services to emerging companies wanting to bring their new medical innovation to Canada. Deborah is one of Canada's most experienced general managers with close to 3 decades of industry experience, both domestic and international, and she's an amazing person overall. In this episode, Deb will share her insights on how to optimize one's approach to planning a market entry in Canada and the commercial options that emerge from that analysis and the pitfalls to avoid. Welcome to the podcast, Deb.
I'm glad to be here.
Okay, well, Deb, for the audience, tell us briefly about yourself and the professional journey that led you to where you are today.
Okay. Well, I went directly into pharmaceutical career from my studies, scientific studies, and I started in the technical area of the industry. So I was analyzing clinical trial data in a little cubicle when I started, and then I moved on to domestic and international regulatory. I worked with local R&D, and it was when I was doing that I got a lot of exposure to the other functions in the company. I decided that I was interested in the commercial side of the business, did an MBA, and subsequently moved into marketing, business unit management, general management, and then I held some international regional VP or executive VP positions around the world. And from there, after about 2.5 decades of working in the industry, I wanted to do something new, and I wanted to parlay my experience, leverage my experience in understanding a lot of the breadth of the functions in the company, and then as a general manager, having oversight of those functions as well. I wanted to parlay that into working with new companies that wanted to come to Canada and help them bring, new medical innovation into the space as efficiently and as effectively as I could.
Deb, what would you say is the first thing, the most fundamental thing a company should consider before entering the Canadian market?
Well, I'm talking first and foremost about international companies here, so not large multinationals that have an affiliate in Canada. So if we're thinking about, U.S., European, Asian, international companies who are coming for the first time to Canada, my most important piece of advice, I think, would have to be don't be Pennywise and pound foolish, as my grandmother used to say. A lot of incredible rigor goes into working on and developing their primary market, like the U.S., like Europe, or Japan, for example. But it's amazing to me how often companies can fall down in terms of their approach to the Canadian market. So I really believe that, and I know that an early investment in a rigorous analysis of the landscape, doing a market evaluation, really thinking out your strat plan and the different ways you could approach the market will save you so much money in the long term and really predict your long-term success in the market.
Deb, can you elaborate? What do you mean by a penny wise, a pound foolish?
What I mean by that is Canada is a top 10 pharmaceutical market. It's number 10 in the world. It's worth billions of dollars in the market. It's a sophisticated and complex market that requires the same kind of level of rigor that you would approach the European market with, the Japanese market or the U.S. market as examples. And it's worth really applying that rigor because although it's a complex and relatively small market, as I said, it's a top 10 market and it presses above its weight in terms of international medical practice and in terms of how lucrative it can be. So we always say to people it's really important to invest early to make sure that you scope out your approach to the market and the market evaluation before you actually start doing things. There's a real desire to start doing things, because people procrastinate and time starts going by and then they panic and think, oh my God, the first thing I need to do is hire a general manager because I don't know how to approach the market. And that can be absolutely the worst thing to do.
Mm-hmm. What about the infamous the 1/10 rule?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of approaches that people take if they're, in my opinion, sort of cutting corners, and that is, okay, we've done a lot of research, for example, in the U.S. market, divide by 10 as a rule of thumb because of the population size, and you'll have an estimate of the market. I think that falls apart almost right away when you're looking at the pricing disparity in a lot of products between the U.S. and Canada. So in my experience, only rarely does the rule of 1 in 10 apply. The other approaches are, we have people in our analytics team that have done some work or know a bit about the Canadian markets. They'll work up numbers using either an international plug-and-play model or their own forecast model and try to come up with some very high-level numbers. And what I've seen when that happens and people think, oh, we've got something reasonable, they're feeling pretty good about it till they bring it to the executive committee and they have to defend their approach and their investments in Canada. And it becomes pretty clear very quickly that they haven't got all the information they need to underpin the analysis.
Deb, why do you think so few firms are willing to invest in a comprehensive market analysis?
That's a great question, Sam. I really think that with the companies that we primarily deal with, I understand it very much. I've worked in the U.S. market. It's or the European market. Your primary market is so overwhelming and the focus is so critical when you first launch that most of the cutting-edge companies that we're working with bringing new innovation have a skeletal infrastructure at this point. So the resources that they have are largely focused on their primary market, wherever that is, and they're struggling. They've only got so much financing, and they're focusing on their primary market, and it's a difficult decision to make an investment in yet another market that they know little about at the beginning, anyway.
Mm-hmm. What about the conundrum that we all face: affiliate versus a strategic partner versus just an outright out-licensing? Mm-hmm. What do you think of that?
Well, that's one of the reasons why we say Pennywise and pound foolish is, or I say it, and that is, I think the most important thing you can do is two things: is do the landscape analysis, really get a depth of understanding of what's going in the marketplace, and put in all the inputs that you have to for market access, regulatory, et cetera, to come up with a market evaluation. And based on that market evaluation, there's a number of different ways that you can come into the market. And we're seeing a lot more creativity in the last 10, 20 years than we used to see. In the old days, it was, I have a product, I'm going to set up an affiliate in Canada, and I'm going to carry on that way. It's going to be a branch or an affiliate of a multinational or a branch office. And now we see, especially since there's a lot more rare disease drug coming in, niche drugs coming in, that there might be some gap before the next product in the pipeline, and it's a relatively small product, although a great product. And those rules don't necessarily apply because the infrastructure costs of running that niche product, even a skeleton team is $2.5 million, let's say, probably $3 million. And so people are starting to look at the options of, should I partner with somebody locally in Canada? Should I take on a strategic partner? Should I fully out-license? Or sometimes when they partner for 3 years and take the brand back, or 3 to 5 years, or set up an affiliate. There's a lot more options and creativity being applied today than there used to be, and which I think is great because there's a lot of implications to that choice. Tax implications, revenue implications, your whole P&L is affected by that first decision. And if you jump in and hire a GM before you've thought that through, that's going to be a very expensive mistake.
Mm-hmm. Do you think is there a rule of thumb that you follow?
It's my own very personal rule of thumb. I think everybody's number would be a bit different, but I always look at it, and I know those of us who have been general managers in the business, both for smaller products and large products in Canada, you pretty much can very quickly know this is how much it would cost for a basic infrastructure or a more substantial infrastructure. So even if you have a small product, if your revenues aren't peaking at least $10 million, and many companies would say it should be 20 at least, but I've run things in a frugal way, in a creative way, so I understand that you could do it for $10 million. You really should be looking at other other alternatives than setting up your own shop, unless you've got a whole portfolio coming behind it, and it's an investment, a strategic investment to build your corporate brand up front.
Yeah, I would imagine if you partner with an existing pharma company, a local partner here, you're going to be splitting your profits, which would dilute the investment overall. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I'm not the biggest fan of that option. I have either helped companies look for that or been in that situation myself when I was in the corporate world. And another rule of thumb that we use is if you're partnering with somebody, so you're both actively involved, whether it's a co-promotion or co-marketing or whatever your arrangement is that it takes 40% more management time to manage that collaboration. And of course, you're profit sharing. So, probably best case, the originator is ending up with 60, maybe 70%, and giving up a good chunk of the profit for some shared investment and all the rest of it. But it's also taking a ton of management time. And if you're a small company already that's struggling with infrastructure, and then you have to manage a partnership, that can add a lot of complexity.
Do you have any examples of of a creative partnership with a smaller niche company that you've seen?
Well, I could think of several examples. I won't share those because I was involved with those and who the people involved are. But I can certainly think of a few examples, as I said, of companies that had a product or a small basket of products that was worth $5 to $10 million. Who looked at, can I look at a contract sales force? How should I do this? Should I give it to a big pharma company? And found an arrangement where they could launch and then carry in their basket another company's product for 3 to 5 years to bolster their sales force so they had more things to talk about. Some of the cost was shared. And then at 5 years, that company comes into the market with their second product. They hand it back. Everybody's had a good arrangement. That can work quite well if you hand over, in my opinion, the reins to a really good partner in the market.
Yeah, imagine that's why you need both an upfront market analysis, but also tie that in with a business plan. So that transition, that long-term transition is laid out, that you have a beacon to follow.
Mm-hmm. We really think that, especially when you're new to the market, doing a brand plan is completely insufficient. You need a corporate plan. Mm-hmm. You're absolutely right, Sam. I mean, it's what is your long-term vision for this company, globally and locally? What are you trying to achieve? And based on, we ask a lot of questions when we work with clients. What is that you want to achieve in 5 years and in 10 years? And based on that will help us direct not the market evaluation, but maybe some of the decisions and recommendations we would make related to that. Management preference is still an enormous thing in the industry. You'd be surprised, even despite the amount of rigor we put against analysis. There's strong management preferences in the cultures of the companies we work with.
And there's so much more to consider as well when investing, right? Your tax liability, your employment liability. Mm-hmm. There's a lot to consider. So what would you say how should someone put this comprehensive market analysis together, and what advice can you give the audience?
Well, I'd quickly like to touch on some of the ways people do approach it and perhaps how I would recommend they do instead. So as I said earlier, some firms do in-house projections and they come up with a very raw number. They discuss it in their commercial operations team. They bring it forward and they move forward. They hire a GM in Canada who then turns around and hires a VP of marketing or a head of marketing and a commercial operations person and an admin, and then they turn around and hire all the consultants they need to actually answer the questions. And before you know it, you're in for $2 or $2.5 million, and you still haven't answered the question. You're 6 months. What is this market worth, and what is our plan? So I would not recommend that, at least in that order. Alternatively, they might hire a U.S. or international provider that's not based in Canada, do one of those plug-and-play models that is used. And I think that can be very helpful at the front end, high level, when companies are making clinical trial decisions and investment decisions, but not when you're talking about how should we actually enter a market. Mm-hmm. The old rule of 1 in 10 that's developed internally, as we talked about already. And then the one that bothers me probably the most is when people say, well, we need some expertise, so we're going to hire a lot of different people from Canada. Somebody in our office knows somebody in regulatory in Canada. Someone else knows somebody who runs a legal firm or works in legal, communications, market access, 3PL, HR, you name it. And then you take a team, let's say they're European-based, who's already very stretched, just launched their product potentially in Europe. They have very little management bandwidth, and then they're trying to manage like 7 or 8 different agencies in Canada. It's a nightmare. It's a nightmare for management, but more importantly, it can be very difficult because then you have all these different pieces of advice that aren't being woven together and particularly put into the corporate plan, the brand plan, and the market evaluation in a cohesive way.
Yeah,
like we work cheek to jowl when we put together a market evaluation where our market access people and our advocacy people and everyone is feeding information into that plan and those numbers.
Yeah, you need the conductor to bring every discipline together, because if not, things get missed, right?
I agree.
And the individual components just don't jive together as part of a cohesive strategy.
That is why I've always been a fan. I sound like I'm dissing the idea of hiring a general manager. Not at all. You absolutely, if you set up in Canada, would want a general manager if you run your own subsidiary. The general manager is that conductor. If you're hiring a firm to help you prepare for, those investment decisions in Canada, you need a conductor in that case too. And I think that's the person who brings it all together and make sure that you're putting all the right elements in, and they're basically de facto your eyes and ears on the ground to make sure that things that are happening you're informed of. So we really think that's important, and the reason I want to stress that it's important to have an integrated advisory group up front is that the pre-launch period is so critical. IQVIA did a study years ago that showed that your long-term success in the market can be easily predicted by your first 3 months' performance, which tells you something very clearly. It's all in your pre-launch decisions and preparation. That's where the secret sauce is. It's not the great talent that you hired and what they do after you launch. Of course, that's important. But it's that upfront planning and having the right integrated approach to make the right decisions, and then everything falls into place very well.
So how could a model like Accelera help clients?
Well, we think, this is the reason when I left the corporate world and wanted to do something like this, I really didn't even for a minute consider hanging up my own shingle because I'd seen so many people do that who had been presidents and then hung up a shingle and were sort of a GM for hire, which a GM for hire can be very helpful, but they're only as good as the functional experts they're working with. And I think it's, we built Accelera around the model of saying that you need the conductor, but the conductor's nothing without the orchestra, right? So you need everybody to be working together and to provide the best product overall that you can. So that's why we developed a model where we have, A to Z in-house commercial functional experts, market access, communications, advocacy, everybody's lined up, all the market insights and analytics. And then we have former presidents and general managers who are conducting that orchestra basically for clients.
Yeah, I find in my experience that the GMs that come from big pharma aren't necessarily the ones best suited to run a small startup. And I say that because when they're with big pharma, they have huge billion-dollar infrastructure behind them.
Yes.
Someone's taking care of regulatory. It just happens. Someone takes care of quality.
Right.
It just happens.
Right.
Now, it's you,
Yes.
right? You're on your own, and there's a
Yes.
shoestring budget, and you need to have those competencies to understand that it's not just sales and marketing, right? There's a huge infrastructure that's behind you that makes it all
agree.
work.
In fact, we often advise clients, we say to them, number one, we're happy to help you find people in Canada because it's a pretty small market, and we tend to, across our team, have a pretty big Rolodex. We understand who's who and where they've worked, and we know there's a fantastic roster of talent in Canada that is ready to move up into general management or president positions. And in most cases, I highly recommend that because they're eager, they've got a fire in their belly to do it, they've come straight out of hopefully multiple functional areas. So they've been right up at the rock face recently, and they're not afraid to roll up their sleeves, as you say, Sam. And if you say you've got a $3 million budget, they're okay. I'm going to move mountains with this $3 million budget. I'm going to make it happen, and this is legacy building for my career. And I'm particularly delighted that I meet quite frequently for coffees or lunches. I could go every day if I wanted with women, younger women that are coming up in the industry who have been commercial operations directors, marketing directors, you name it, and they're ready. They're ready to move up. And I see a lot of hires of very talented young women now, and I'm excited about that.
Couldn't agree more. So what are some of the common mistakes you've seen?
Well, we already talked about the hire the GM right away without due diligence. So try to avoid that situation because the costs mount quickly, and before you know it, the decision is almost taken out of your hand, and you're spiraling into a fait accompli in terms of what you're going to do. I feel the same way about hiring purely a 3PL agency up front or hiring a regulatory agency in isolation of anybody else. I mean, not so much regulatory. Sometimes you've got to do that work early and get some early advice. But it's amazing how many people panic because they've heard they need a drug establishment license, and they go to find a 3PL provider, and next thing you know, they've sort of committed all of the work or some of the services with a company there, and they haven't stepped back and done really a full commercial analysis of what they need to do.
Do you find there's like a panic that sets in?
Yes.
Right? It's like,
I see it all the time.
Canada. Right. All of a sudden, Dell, hire GM, 3PL.
And you know what, Sam? I understand it because people, sometimes people in the Canadian market can say, I don't understand. I sent them an email, 3 weeks ago, and nobody's responded from the U.S. team or the European team. And yet when I worked in the U.S., I worked in Boston, and I oversaw the Canadian business at the same time. I was so preoccupied and consumed with this huge thing that was this opportunity in the U.S. that literally what I did for Canada, I did between 11 p.m. and 11:15 p.m. at night. That's how much energy I had left. So it happens very organically. They don't intend to do that, but these decisions get pushed forward as things happen in the U.S. And then all of a sudden it's like we've had several cases where people have called us and said, oh my God, we're going to have approval in 3 months, and what are we going to do? And it's like, oh, well, we can work with that, but there's such a missed opportunity in that in terms of market preparation. So I think that, to me, one of the key things that I would say a common mistake is that the panic, as you said, Sam, the decisions are procrastinated and then made late and made with inaccurate data or insufficient data, and then you miss this pre-launch period. And the reason why it's so critical, it's critical in all markets, but in the Canadian market, especially with a lot of the small specialty products that we work with, we have a center of excellence model for those specialty areas in Canada, the way we operate, very like a European model. And so you often have situations where 20 to 30% of the key thought leaders or clinicians are prescribing for 70 to 80% of the patients in a complex chronic disease model. And so getting to know that market, those people, the allied health professionals that all support that is so critical to making the right decisions. And it's really about listening and learning and understanding. And you can't do that after you launch very effectively. You really need to do that up front. So doing your analysis, figuring out what you're doing, and whoever is going to be handling the market for you, whether it's yourself or somebody else, getting those feet on the street, a year and a half before you're launching will cement your market success afterwards.
So, Deb, can you touch on why it would be so important to have clinical trials in Canada?
Well, when I first started in the industry, we were lucky. Canada definitely pressed above its weight. It had a sophisticated infrastructure to do clinical trials. So de facto, we got, way more than our 2-point-something% that we should have of world, population in terms of clinical trial participation. But that has shifted tremendously in the last 20 to 25 years, and fairly, I think, as the BRIC countries have come onto the scene and other pharmaceutical markets have grown. As I said, Canada is still top 10, and participation in clinical trials is enormously important. It just you don't always have that leverage as much as you used to, is what I'm saying. So when you have it, that they're the first people you go to and listen and learn from. If you haven't benefited from the clinical trial was also done in Canada for the last 5 to 10 years, then even more so, you've got to focus on your pre-launch period and really get out there, meet the key thought leaders, and understand what they're thinking and how your product might fit into that.
Mm-hmm. So it's not just the pre-launch, post, pre-approval, but it's thinking about Canada in the development stage, getting key opinion leaders engaged fairly early on in your product,
right?
So that we can tap into their expertise, and become and have them become really your champions down the road.
Absolutely. It's one of the first things that I would ask a company when I work with them. Do you have any Canadians on your global advisory board? Do you have a global advisory board? Which studies were done in Canada, and how many people and how many patients and how disparate in terms of geography were there. That's part of the landscape analysis. Where do you already have some uptake? And sometimes it's not clinical trials. Sometimes some amazing work has been done in Canada on pharmacoepidemiology in terms of your brand. There's other ways, radiology, for example. So we look for those pockets of people who've had experience with the early development of your product and can speak with some authority about it.
Yeah. I find, when we talk about centers of excellence, KOLs and centers of excellence in Canada, sometimes we get pigeonholed into the U.S. model, and that doesn't apply. The Canadian model for center of excellence is very different.
I've seen both. I worked in multiple sclerosis for many years, and for decades actually, and I worked in both the U.S. and Canada, working in that area, and I saw a lot of overlap there in terms of what was offered in a core center, but the difference was more what I pointed out, that 70% of the patients in the U.S. were being treated by community neurologists. In Canada, 70% were being treated by clinics where they had integrated expertise, physios, OTs, et cetera. That's a very different model, and you have to approach that with a different level of sophistication and a different kind of, account representative. You really have to think that through.
So, Deb, as we wrap this up, what tips can you offer someone considering a market entry in Canada?
The thing that comes to mind right away is things like, your talent is absolutely critical. We've already talked a lot about market preparation, so I don't have to reiterate that. But then we move on to the people, and just be aware. Be aware if you're coming from Europe or the U.S. that employment legislation is different in Canada. Don't assume it's the same. It certainly was a wake-up call for me when I worked in the U.S. at first, that severance packages are totally different. The expectation that you can remove someone quite easily is prevalent in the U.S., but certainly doesn't apply in Canada. And it's not something to be afraid of. It's just something to be aware of. Work with someone who's going to develop good employment contracts for you, and be aware of what your obligations are around that. So be aware that that's different. And similarly, the compliance world is different in Canada. And I'll give you one or two minor, specific examples. A lot of people are familiar with the direct-to-consumer differences in promotion, whereas in the U.S., you can have ads for your drug in People magazine, and certainly you're not able to do that in Canada. There's very strong restrictions in terms of, your drug and its price and its name. Basically, there's a combination of things that you can put into the consumer world, but certain combinations aren't allowed. So it's very restricted in Canada. And in terms of, let's say, advocacy is, there's a lot of similarities between the U.S. and Canada, but I know in the U.S. it's devolved really, at least by the time I left. When we wanted to work with a patient association, it was becoming much more that we were getting a folder that said, here's the 8 things you can sponsor this year. You choose and send us a check or don't. And the opportunity to really collaborate with them based on compliance rules had really changed over the years that I was there. In Canada, of course, we have lots of regulations around that and guidelines, but we still have more of a collaborative culture here, I think, in terms of being able to work multiple companies appropriately with patient organizations and like groups. And it's particularly important in Canada because public reimbursement in some therapeutic spaces is an essential element of your product mix. And you need patient advocacy the voices from the patients in order to make sure that actually happens. There has to be a strong voice out there. So beware of employment legislation differences, the compliance environment. I tell people when they come, be aware of the different options that are available for you in terms of the self-regulated market, in terms of compliance, and decide who you are and who you want to be in 5 to 10 years, and then conduct yourself accordingly. So that's an important decision to make up front. I also said earlier that in terms of your hires, a lot of people think because they're not here in Canada and it's so far away, they have to get executive recruiters, and there's often good, can be a good choice. But there's a lot of other ways to recruit good talent in Canada that are cost effective, and I would suggest you lean on the advisors that you do have in Canada because, as I said, they have a great Rolodex and they can help you at essentially no cost, at least introduce you to some really good people that you can talk to.
Deb, thank you so much for your advice.
You're welcome. We could talk forever. I think.
I think we could.
I think
we could, but we do have to keep this podcast somewhat short.
Fair enough.
So how can our audience connect with you, Deb?
Well, you can check us out at www.acceleracanada.com or our LinkedIn page, which is also Accelera Canada. You can reach out to me personally. I'm always happy to hear from anyone at Deborah, DEBORAH.Brown at acceleracanada.com. Or drop into our office in Toronto at 219 Dufferin. We're always happy for people in Liberty Village.
Liberty Village, right off the exhibition stadium.
That's right.
All right. Thanks a lot, Deb. I should also mention contact details for Deb are also available on our website at the pharmapodcast.ca. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe and follow me on LinkedIn to stay up to date on future podcasts. This podcast, along with the transcript of the show, can be found on our website at thepharmapodcast.ca. Thank you to our sound engineer, Errol Francis, and the town of Oakville for providing the studio. If you'd like to be a guest on this podcast, or if there is a topic we should cover in future episodes, please connect with me via LinkedIn.